Okay, in this episode we're going to look at adding some lights to our scene. We're just going to make a very simple light setup, and I will go through the different types of lights that you can use in Clarice, and how they can be best utilized, as well as some artistic theory on how to utilize lights in the best way in order to achieve an interesting and compelling image. We will also add these lights to our render pass so we can actually see what our lit render looks like. So let's start off by just going into our lights context, and here let's just create a new light physical, and we only want to be using physical lights because the legacy ones are not based on real world physics. They're a little bit outdated. They're how lighting used to work in the past in 3D softwares. So let's instead use our new physical lights, which are much more accurate to real world situations. So we have our area lights, which are cylinder, plane, sphere, and spot. And these are quite useful. But in this tutorial, we're only going to use the distant and environment lights. So the distant light, which we will create first, is an equivalent of the directional light that you would perhaps get in Maya or other lighting and rendering softwares. So this is something I imagine most of you will be familiar with. So let me just back out of my camera view, and let's just have a look. It doesn't hurt to increase the size of your light this way, just so we have a better clue of where it is and where it's pointing. It doesn't affect the properties of it in any way, or the strength. So let's bring it up and put it there. Maybe around here. Cool. Let's rotate it a bit this way. Cool. So now, let's go into our render passes, and let's create a new image, and let's keep this image at a very low resolution, at 50%, which basically this resolution takes the resolution multiplier takes the resolution and multiplies it by 50%, so we're only working at 50% of 720p right now. We're just wanting a low resolution render just to roughly see what we're doing at this stage. So here, let's create a new 3D layer, and let's add an active camera, and let's select our ray tracer for our renderer, and for lights, let's just select our distant light. For geometries, let's bring in our Geo All group, and do the same for shadows, ray tracing, and global illumination. Okay, so currently you can't see anything, and actually an issue might be that if you get this, the issue might be that if you go to your ray tracer, it might be currently set to legacy for the integration model. You want to change it to path tracer, which works with the physical lights and materials. So that looks good. So let's just make this a little bit bigger. Okay. Okay, now we have this working. Let's go back to our lights context, and let's create a new light, physical, and environment. And the environment light is just something that you plug an HDRI into. In other softwares it might be called a dome light or a sky dome, so you might be already familiar with that. So first we want to import our HDRI image that we can connect to our environment light. So we go to streaming map file, and here we import our HDRI image. Make sure it has .hdr to make sure that it's HDRI. So let's go to our environment and scroll down, and let's go to our color, and let's click this little checkerboard icon, and let's select our HDRI map here. So now let's create a new group, and we're going to call it lights underscore all underscore group, and let's just add our 2 lights. Apply. So now they're both in this group, and let's go to our layer 3D, and in the lights let's now plug in this group, which will have both of the lights. So we should be seeing the result of both the distant and the environment light. And it takes a second to render. Okay, so I skipped ahead a little bit just to have a more final result of the render. So it's slightly too blue at the minute, so let's go into our... let's first make a material editor. Here to the side it's getting a little bit cluttered, but hopefully I can show what I'm doing. So, yeah, let's just expand this slightly here and here. Okay, in between our environment node and the HDRI map node in the material editor, we will want to create a new node. Just let's make a little bit more space, and let's create a node called saturation. And we'll just plug this in, and we'll drop the saturation down to make it slightly less blue. Yeah, minus 50 sounds good. Okay, yeah, that's pretty cool. Let's see if I can use a remap to make this slightly better. You don't have to edit your HDRI, however, I think you can make some changes here, and Clarice is useful in that regard because you can make the changes straight in Clarice instead of having to go into Photoshop. So let's just maybe have a look at increasing the contrast. Okay, that's slightly better. So let's turn that off. Okay, now we have our 2 basic lights, the environment and the distant light. And this gives us a little basic setup, but it's not very good right now. So how do we think about light more artistically? Well, I think we could, for example, make sure that we could make sure that our light is hitting more in this area and drawing the viewer's eye and their attention more towards there. I think we could make that quite a bit more interesting. I think currently it's quite boring. We could have more light here as well in order to draw the viewer's attention here as well. Yeah, currently it's not quite working in terms of being a path towards the focal point of the image, and I think we can place the light slightly more strategically to have the light lead towards the background. So let's have a look at improving this. So I think we can rotate it a bit, maybe this way, to hopefully bring more light into that area. That's better already. Yeah, quite a bit more interesting in that area already. So let's see about raising it some more. That's maybe too much. You kind of have to eyeball this a little bit, as it's hard to tell exactly what the lighting looks like while your render is still updating. So it can be a little bit hit and miss, but you just gotta play around with it a little bit. So let's turn this down slightly. It might be pointing up, which we wouldn't want the sun to be doing. So let's bring it down just experimenting a little bit and trying to remember exactly how I had originally done this and what settings I had. It was something very similar to this. So you see now I have separate elements being highlighted by the distant light and kind of silhouetting them and drawing attention to them and hopefully moving the audience's eye throughout the picture. And you can have several different renders that you do at this stage just to see which one works the best and what kind of light. So maybe let's just change this to -45. Yeah, that's quite similar now. Maybe a bit more. Okay. That should do it. So now... Okay, yeah, this looks quite a bit better. So now we have interest in a lot of these areas, and furthermore, we've silhouetted a lot of these shapes and really cut them out and modeled them with light. So the main idea I try to think about while working with light is to contrast light against shadow as much as I can. So, for example, here we have in the foreground a piece of a building that is lit, and behind it there's shadow. Or here, again, shadow against light and light against shadow. Here is shadow against the light of the background. And here as well. Just these kind of details add a lot of interest and excitement to the image. Contrast usually does. So I'm kind of trying to cut out a lot of these building shapes as I'm working and trying to think ahead to what will look good later on. So I'm trying to get them to be easy to determine what they are. When the viewer looks at the image, I want to eliminate as much confusion as possible. I want people to be able to tell what these buildings are with one glance, and if I cut them out with light, that helps me. So I think this is quite a decent lighting setup here now. So let me just go back into the city here, and I'll create a water plane which I appear to have lost. And let me just expand this. I'll make it much bigger by just typing in the numbers. Okay. And let's bring it down. Let's just zoom in here. And I want it to be at about this level, I think. So now we're getting some nice light falling on the water as well, in the center of the image. It's similar to what I previously had. So now let's create a couple more render passes in order to be able to get a simple rudimentary render, which we can bring into Photoshop and just kind of do a little bit of concept art over it, not for the final image, but just to be able to understand the image a little bit better at this stage and maybe come up with some better ideas while we're still working and we're in a phase where it is easy for us to make these changes. So we want to go into Photoshop, play around a little bit, and see if we can fix some of the rough areas of this 3D setup before we fully commit to it. So one problem I'm already seeing that I need to address is that my shadows are very sharp there at the connection with the light. So we'll address this by going into our distant light. And if we scroll down and we go to the angle, basically this allows us to control the sharpness of the highlight, or the shadows rather. So if I change this to 20, you can see that all of the shadows are now much more diffuse and much softer. It looks like the light is shining through some clouds, maybe. So maybe we don't want this much. I want slightly more sharp shadows, so let's put this to 2. And this will soften the edges of the light a little bit, so they're not extremely harsh, but without making it too soft. And actually, let's change the exposure slightly. just to draw some more attention. Okay. Let's go to shaders. And let's create a new texture, ray trace, occlusion. And this will help us create our ambient occlusion render pass. So we click here and go to new material matte. So this will be our ambient occlusion material. So we'll call this AO underscore matte. And here in the color, we'll click that icon and connect our occlusion texture. So these two work together now. Okay. So here in our layer 3D, let's right click it and duplicate it. And let's scroll down and go to shading, where override material is, and select our AO matte material. Okay, so actually now if I disable the layer 3D at the bottom, I'll be able to just look at it rendering the ambient occlusion layer because it was rendering both at the same time there. So we can see our ambient occlusion here. Let's go to the occlusion texture and let's just adjust some of the settings. So let's just change the radius to something higher than 1 centimeter. That is very tiny because the scene is huge. So let's increase this to 1 meter. So now we're getting outlines of all of the edges and cracks in between the geometry. And this is very useful because we can use this as, for example, a mask for selecting these edges later on in Photoshop, or we can use these to add a little bit of sharpness and I guess contrast to all of the corners of the image later on to really make things pop. But still, I think this is still a bit too narrow, too sharp, so let's increase this to 10. Okay, so like that's a lot more soft. Perhaps too wide, but sometimes it can help having two of these layers. So one is much more softer and wider, and one is much more sharper and narrower for the tiny cracks. But let's just set it to 5 meters for now, and that's a nice in between, kind of what we want. So if we click here on our layer 3D and click F2, we can rename it. So let's call this AO. And here, let's rename this layer to base render. Okay. And now, this part of Clarice works quite like Photoshop. So, for example, I can change my blend modes of the ambient occlusion from normal to multiply. So, what multiply will do is, actually, if I just go back, it will take all of the white parts of the image and multiply them by what's underneath, and all the black parts and will multiply them by what's underneath. So white is 1, the value, so everything multiplied by 1 stays the same. But black is 0, so anything multiplied by 0 is 0. So by multiplying these two together, here for example, we can see that those black parts will become darker on the layer underneath and the white area will remain the same. So if I multiply here and let's zoom in, you can see, okay, let's zoom out actually. Clarice renders in a peculiar way where while it's rendering you can zoom out to see the finished resolution. So it's not perfect, but if I enable and disable here, you can see that I'm getting the ambient occlusion as shadows on my base render layer. So there is an effect. So it's affecting all of the cracks, making them darker. Before I go further, let's just go to shaders and create a new texture, utility, Z depth, and we will create our depth pass as well. So let's create a new material matte, and we're going to call this Z underscore matte. Okay, and let's just connect our Z depth texture here. again, let's go to our AO layer and duplicate it, and we'll set it to normal. Let's disable the other two. We'll rename this to Z. And let's scroll down and override the material with Z-matte. So now this is quite bright. Let's go back to our shaders and go into the Z-depth texture. We want to use custom for both the near and the far mode, and then we'll change the near distance to 1 meter and the far distance to 100 meters. So, actually, not quite correct. We want these colors to be inverted. So, for our near we want black, and for far we want white. Okay, so that is more like what fog works like in real life, right? You get a build-up of value as you go into the distance, the further you see. So here, let's change the far distance to 1 kilometer. Perfect. And the near distance, we can push it slightly more. We want more range. We want as much range as possible. So whatever is the closest object to camera, which is these buildings on the left and at the top, we want to add more contrast there, just to make sure that we push our Z depth as far as possible. Let's put it up to 30. Maybe even to 50. Okay, maybe let's settle for 40. I think this encapsulates the full range between black and white. Actually, just so we're sure we're getting all of the detail at the top, let's go down to 30. Let's just stay there. And so now our closest objects are black and the furthest objects are white. So we're utilizing the full range of the spectrum. So now if I enable the other layers again, and for the Z depth, I'll set the blending mode to screen. So if I zoom out, because this is the quality that is currently rendered, if I zoom in, it's still rendering. But here it's finished, and we can see that our fog works already and adds quite a lot to the image. So now what we will want to do is wait for these renders to finish at half resolution, which this is. And we will start trying to bring them into Photoshop and playing around with them and trying to see if we can adjust the lighting and the composition slightly to see what ideas we can get out of the image now before we commit to any big changes. And yeah, let's just have a little bit of fun before we start making any big changes. Okay, so now we'd like to export these render passes and bring them into Photoshop so we can composite them there separately. So I'll just mention that in my image settings, I've actually upped the resolution to 100%, just so I have a clear image to show you while I'm working. Feel free to use whatever resolution you'd like, and whatever is quick on your computer. This is not a step that requires very high resolution. So first of all, let's disable our Z and AO layers and just have our base render. And let's just click on the little save icon. You can do this once it has rendered 100% there in the image view. So let's just click to save, and we'll call the file base VO1. Okay. And let's change our ambient occlusion to normal blending mode. And let's again save this, because we want this as a separate image that we can adjust in Photoshop. And we'll save this as AO_VO1.exr. And let's do the same with our Z. Normal, save, and Z_VO1.exr. Okay, so now let's just jump into Photoshop and adjust these layers there.